Leymah, again, thank you for doing this. And I'd like to kick off, you have said that the first Liberian Civil War really quickly transitioned you from a child into an adult in a matter of hours. Help us understand a little bit about that transition, that moment. It sounds frighteningly powerful and overwhelming.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you all, Lynne, and everyone who invited me on today. Today is my Zoom day. I've been in a UN Zoom, and now I'm Zooming out here a lot. Well, before I even talk about that transition, I must talk about briefly my socialization because it puts everything into perspective. I grew up in a peri-urban community. I can't say that it was extremely poor. Economically, yes, but in terms of values and love and culture, we're extremely rich. So there was that sense of our collective humanity. If your child, we actually grew up in a bubble. And that's the only way I can describe it because we didn't know whose parent didn't have money for food. We didn't know who, everything was collective. And after several years, my parents were able to raise enough money to move to their dream community. And we moved to that space and we moved there just a year the war started. And I had just started university because the war started 2 days after my high school graduation in 1989. So we moved to that community and I used to shuttle back and forth to the University of Liberia. And this morning, I had a lit class. My father, who worked with the security agency, did not come home that day, or he left extremely early. My mom and my sister worked at the government hospital, so they woke up early that morning to drive to work. And by 10 in the morning, or say by 8, because they didn't get very far, there was this last loud boom and shooting. And this old man who was internally displaced in our home said, the rebels have arrived. And I remember me trying to shelter my nieces and nephew because I was the only grown child of my parents at home, grown, meaning 17. And before I knew it, my aunts and those in the house were saying to me, you have to be in charge now because legally, culturally, you're the only one of your parents here and you have to make decisions. From 10 that morning up to 7 p.m. that night, I was in charge of over 25 individuals who had become internally displaced. I was now thinking about where is food? How do we ration food? What important documents do we have in this house that I have to keep? How do I position people to sleep? Because a lot of the people who were coming were friends of my parents through church relationship, and that I now had to say, oh, you, sir, will have to sleep in the living room while your wife sleep in this side, and no 17-year-old have to do that. And that was my moment of growing up.
Powerful. Thank you.
Yeah, the description of the first day of the war, and then from then on, I just want to hear a little bit more about what happened after that before we go to the next question.
Well, from then on, it became, for a few days, I was dreaming that everything will go back to normal because I'm waiting for my mom to come home. Can they just come and take over their lives? And then she comes home maybe 4 or 5 days later, totally traumatized. Mentally, she's broken down. She was in no shape because she had seen death. Her car had been taken from her under gunpoint, and they had lied down flat on the floor in the house that they managed to escape in for 3 solid days as gun pounded that community. And when the shooting eased, they had to crawl through the swamp to get home to us. So she gets home and I'm excited. Here you are, this is your house, and all these people are your guests. And the first thing my eldest sister said to me, she's in no shape to make decisions. And then my sister decided she was going to some other place. And I then became not just the caregiver of my nieces and nephew and younger siblings, but I became the caregiver of my mother. I had to think for her. So we became displaced in Sincor. We had to walk, we came to town. And then I had to literally say to her in the morning, we will have this for breakfast. And from 1990 till today, I know my mom so well that from her voice, I can tell when she's sad, when she's stressed, or when she's ready to break down. Because her voice, all of a sudden it won't come out. And as she would just say anything. The only thing she would be able to do was to pray, like pray at night, but during the daytime, she was virtually a robot. And I had to think for her. And in that moment, because my dad worked with the security agency, we had to be very careful where we sheltered, because we could shelter in enemy's territory and get the entire family killed. So some days she would just wake up and say, let's go this way. And I would have to be the one to put my feet down to say, if you want to go, because she virtually became a child. If you want to go, go, but I'm not allowing you to take any of these children with you. And then she would cry for a moment, and then she would say, okay, whatever you want to do is up to you.
Wow, huge responsibility for a 17-year-old, my God. And
one of the days we got attacked again, where we were internally displaced, and this was before the church massacre. We got attacked that morning, and the church got attacked that night. And they lined all of us on the wall, and they were beating people and taking people to go execute them. And she kept motioning to me. So I kept moving slowly until I got to her. And she said, if I get killed, please ask them to give you my body, because I have a lot of money wrapped around my waist in a tiny cloth, and you would need it to survive. Fortunately for us, we were spared, but that just increased the level of dysfunctionality mentally for her. Yeah.
Wow, my God. Wow. Well, the impact of being in war firsthand and seeing people killed and tortured and all the horrible things that you witnessed gave you the enormous depth and power that you have become a trauma counselor to not only your mother, but to many people. And also the child soldier issue that took place in Liberia. Can you talk about that and the capacity of the country, and particularly you, to heal these children that were forced to kill and become child soldiers? Can you talk a little bit about that, Leymah?
Well, one of the things that I want to do for those listening is to position my faith, because for those listening, you hear me talk a lot about God, because my faith is very important to me. And at the beginning of my journey during the war, again, I have to go back to my childhood in order to clearly state what I'm about to say. My family were very religious. We would go to church on the 31st of every year, and everyone was given a piece of paper to write down their prayers for the year. And there was a big drum that would be put in the middle of the churchyard, and you have to put that paper in, and then a big bonfire was made. And the smoke, as a young child, I would stand and just watch the smoke go up and smile, because I knew that God was, my prayers was, the smoke was a representative of my prayers going up to God. And because I was a very sickly child, my first memory of being hospitalized was at 8 when I got cholera. And I still remember that I was in intensive care, and I was in and out of consciousness, but every time I opened my eyes, I would see my dad's face at that glass waiting. That was my first, and then eventually I developed all kinds of stomach disease. Like I was literally a frequent visitor in every hospital for no less than a day from 8 years old up until the war. So when we moved and went back and forth as refugees to Ghana and back, we came home. I needed to do something because my life had taken a different turn. And so I started doing this social work program that introduced me to child soldiers. And I always tell the story by saying that God had a sense of humor, because those were the people I hated the most. These boys were the ones, in my opinion, who had done everything wrong. And it wasn't until I started working with them that mindset changed, because here you are, you're interacting with these 16, 17 years olds who joined the war at 7, 8, 9. Mm. And then when I started working with them, there would be Saturdays where they would just look for me everywhere, because they had access to me Monday to Friday, but the cutoff for me was that Saturday and Sunday I had to be at home with my children. And one of them, who was 16 at the time, in 1999, he had his right arm amputated. One weekend, couldn't find me. Monday, he came to my office. I volunteered with the church trauma healing program. And you could tell that he had spent the whole weekend high on crack, alcohol. He looked bad, he smelled bad. But I was working with them, but I was working with them because I needed to do something for my children, and I still hated them. But that was a turning point, because he came that morning, and then we sat down, and he just broke down and cried. At that moment, I wasn't looking at a 16-year-old killer. I was looking at the 9-year-old boy arrested in that 16-year-old body. The 9-year-old boy who was left behind by his mother because she couldn't manage to carry all of her children, so she only carried the young ones. The 9-year-old boy whose innocence was stolen from him. And I think that was the turning point for me. That was the beginning of me really understanding that in order for me to journey as a peace builder, the first thing I needed to do was to tear down my walls, the stereotypical walls that I had built between myself and, quote unquote, the perpetrators.
Wow.
It's overwhelming, just to be honest. Thank you for sharing. What is stunning to me is, as someone who was in a situation where people are killing each other, women are being raped, there's power struggles that seem almost impossible to understand what's all going on. In the midst of all this, you found the Women of Liberia Mass Action for Peace. And you've mentioned your faith, but what is also impressive is this was a movement of both Christian and Muslim women. So help us understand a little bit about how you built trust when so much pain and suffering and so much division. And we talked a little bit yesterday about also how power can often use division to split folks that are struggling. Tell us about that.
So when we started our peace movement, it started with the Women Peacebuilding Network. And it was literally just trying to put women together to work for peace. And it didn't have a religious thing about it. It was just trying to focus on community women. And then one day I had this dream that I always talk about. And it's like this voice telling me to put the women together to pray for peace, the women of the church. And so I go to my boss, and he was a pastor at the time in this same trauma healing program. And I said to him, Reverend, I had this dream last night, and this voice was telling me to put the women together to pray for peace. And I said, well, because you're a pastor, can you call the church women and give them this dream so that they can implement? And he looked at me and said, no, Leymah, the dream bearer is always the dream carrier. If you give your dream to someone else, the next time you see it, you may not recognize it. What I can do is to call these women, and you have to lead. it was very difficult for me because, you know, all this, especially if you combine our culture and our religious practices together, it's almost like you have to be pristine white. I was not married. I was in a relationship that was seen as adultery or fornication. I could outdrink a man when it came to alcohol. You know, so all of these different things put it together, I felt I was not the right person to do this work. But then we started this movement, and the first time we unveiled the movement, this Muslim woman was in our program. She stood up and said she wanted to start the Muslim Women for Peace. And because they didn't have the know-how of putting the group together, I became sucked into going to the mosques every Friday, waiting for them to finish their prayers and sitting with them to tell them some of the basics of peace building. Then when we decided, let's do something the women said they wanted to do, we did a peace building training for both groups. And then they said, oh, we want to do a kind of project together. So we said, okay, but before we could, they decided before they could do that, we said, let's do an interreligious training, nonviolence training. I now had, for the first time in my life, pick up the Quran to start to look into some of the different things and then research. And there was this beautiful research that was done by the Lutheran World Federation on different religious practices and nonviolence. And so that became like, I'm reading the Bible because the backlash when we started the Christian Women Peace Initiative we're getting was that some churches, the women in the churches were saying that I wasn't anyone that God had called because of my lifestyle. So I was getting that backlash. And then when we're bringing the group together, we're hearing all of these different things, but we also started getting tension, especially from the Christian women, that there's no fellowship between darkness and light. And so there's no way we could bring them together. So we had to bring the two groups together, and I realized there was a lot of stereotypes and prejudice that was interacting with everything that they were saying. So the first day I brought the Christian women, we examined women in the Bible and the work that they had done in biblical times. Because the way a lot of these women coming from charismatic churches and evangelical churches were saying is that the Bible says we should learn in silence, that the man is the head and women. So we had to go back to the very Bible and take Deborah. They go into the book of Judges. We took Deborah, we took Esther, all of these women who did great, Rahab the prostitute, all of these women who did great work to save the nation, to show them that this is the same God and these are the same people. But even if you come to New Testament, there were women who were doing blah, blah, blah. Then the second day we brought the Muslim women and had to break it down for them. Let's look at Khadijah, the wife of the prophet, peace be unto him, of the prophet Muhammad, who did great. She was a businesswoman. She was richer than the prophet. So afterwards, we brought the two groups together and we were able to work it, and they signed this MOU to say we will work together, and that's how we started. But even coming together as a group, we still had to break it down further from Christian, Muslim, to reining in our collective humanity. So questions like, does the bullet pick and choose? Does the bullet know a Christian from a Muslim? If a Christian woman lost her child, is the pain in her heart different from the loss that a Muslim woman will feel? What do we have? The rape, for example, if soldiers came in this room right now and asked all of us to strip, would they know a naked Muslim woman from a naked Christian woman? So those were the questions. And it really sunk in that regardless, then finally, my grandmother is still alive and we debate her age, but we think she's about 115 years old. Still alive in Monrovia today, but she had a best friend who was a Muslim and she's a Christian. And we brought both of them together with these women to sit and have a conversation. These two women were the traditional birth attendants in our neighborhood. They had been accused of being witches. They had gone through divorce together and all kinds of things. But one defining moment was when someone asked them, So they have been friends for over 60 years. So what role did your faith play in your friendship? And these two old ladies' jaws just dropped. And the Muslim woman said, I did not expect that question. But she turned to my grandmother and said, Martha, when you look at me, do you see a Muslim woman? And my grandmother said, no, I see a sister. I see someone with similar problems. I see a woman that we've worried and prayed together about our children being well. See a woman who has gone through abuse and different things. So they just talked about what binds them as friends. Say we've never, ever thought about the way we pray. And at that moment, there was definite silence in the room. Every woman just sat there staring at each other because finally it sunk in. Once we started the movement, it wasn't again about Christian, Muslim, because we also have women whose brothers were fighting on different sides of the divide. It now became about saving our nation and our movement being the insurance policy that our children will see 10, 15, 20 and live to enter into their future. I'm sorry I went on too long, I think.
No, you covered a number of questions that I had. I want to give Liv a chance. I have a follow-up question, but please, Lynn.
Yeah, we could talk to you for hours. I think that people who have not seen the film, Pray the Devil Back to Hell, and don't know your history would want to know a little bit more about how this miracle of ending the war took place. And there's a question that I want to have you talk about is that you and the women in the movement, the thousands of women that you put together, took a very, from our point of view, interesting approach to get the attention of the men in your lives to stop fighting, and how you raised your voices and raised your visibility to the men to get them to stop. Can you talk about that?
Well, when we started, there was a lot of names that we were called. Toothless bulldogs, attention-seeking women. For those of us who weren't married, President Taylor specifically said some of us were interested in him, having a relationship with him. So there was a lot of derogatory words and statements that were thrown at us. And again, also getting the media, because we didn't have money. We were moving, doing our work from our hearts. So just thinking about strategy all over the place, were just like anything to make people recognize that this movement is here to stay. And then the Muslim woman said, Asatu said, let's do a sex strike. And we said, okay. She said, well, let me tell you something. There are a lot of good men. And these good men are sitting and they have buddies who are fighters. If we pinch the good men at home, they will be forced to ask their buddies to stop fighting. So that evening, we announced a sex strike. That became the only tool we needed for the media. Every local radio station wanted to interview us to see who the hell were these women who were now saying that they were going on a sex strike. And once we got their attention, we're now able to put our message forth, because we had a specific message that we're going to keep protesting until we had a peaceful, negotiated end to the war, a ceasefire, and the deployment of an intervention force. And so once they came to ask about the sex strike, we also then used that opportunity to talk about the work that we were doing. In the urban area, it worked to an extent, but it started getting problematic. But in the rural areas, the women were more smart. They went into the churches and the mosques and brought their husbands along with them to say, take an oath before the Lord that you will not ask us for sex until peace has come to our communities. So they were more strategic in their sex strike than we were in Monrovia. But that was one of the tools that we used as a means of gaining their attention. And over time, I've seen it work in Togo, in other parts of the world. Once people declare sex strike, the media is interested in the story.
Powerful. Leymah, I want to, something we talked about yesterday that I'd like to revisit, because I think it is so important for this moment in our country. And I think we could learn a great deal from your personal experience and the experience of the sisterhood you created in Liberia to create this peace. And that's this notion of righteous anger. You know, for those folks that haven't seen Pray the Devil Back to Hell, and certainly in your book, but it's so visually powerful, where you can just feel the anger just kind of radiating out of you. And we're in a moment of a lot of rage that is well-founded. And the challenge of our day is to harness that in a way. And yesterday, I just thought you had some powerful insights about how you lived through that.
Well, the first thing, we all carry some kind of anger, you know, in us. Every one of us, we carry some kind of anger. And I often say to people that King was an angry man, Dr. Martin Luther King. Mother Teresa was angry. Hitler was angry. Charles Taylor was an angry man. I've been angry most of the time. There's a lot of angry people out there. But like you said, it's just, people call it righteous anger, but the way I describe it, and I have my glass of water here with me, is that anger is fluid. It's neither good nor bad. Anger is like this water in this glass. If you pour it in any other container, it takes the shape of that container. And so what distinguishes a villain from a hero is the container that they choose to pour their anger in. And so Hitler decided to pour his into a violent container. King decided to pour his into a non-violent container. And on the basis of the pouring is how you get remembered, or that's the legacy that you leave. And for me, I tell people there's a distinction between anger and bitterness. Anger is the fuel that I use to do the work that I do. For example, in Liberia, all of these people who started wars, we started with one warring faction. By the time we're coming to the end of the war, we had over 14 different warring factions. And I think over time, we had these multiple factions because people got angry that something wasn't happening. And so they went and started their own group. When we started the movement for women, we knew what pouring anger into a violent container was leading our country to. So we took a step back, took a deep breath, because we could have also made history by being the first women rebel group. But we decided we would take the same anger that everyone is taking and destroying their communities and pour it into a nonviolent container. We will use our pain as a means of confronting society, but also we'll use the anger that we have as a means, as the fuel that we need to push our fight. The women in our movement were people who had all right to be angry. There were women who had been raped multiple times. There was this one time we went to do disarmament, and the boys were in the cantonment center where they go to give their guns. And the UN had a serious problem with logistics and all of the different things, and we went in and volunteered to help. So some of the women had gone to feed some of the soldiers, young men who had been injured. And this one woman was feeding this boy, and he's asked her to set him up. And she sat him up, and he said to her, "Where is your daughter?" And she said, "Did you know my daughter?" He said, "Yes, I knew her. He said, "I know you." She said, "She died." And he said, "I know." He said, "How did you know?" He said, "I killed her." And so she comes back, because every day we do our work, we have to come and do a circle process. She comes back and she narrates this story, crying and holding my feet. The only thing in that moment that I wanted to know was, did you continue feeding him? And she said, "Yes." Isn't that what peace is? Isn't that what you taught us that peace is? Isn't that what a mother is supposed to do? She said, but I did that knowing that I could come to you and pour it all out. So in that moment of her pain, her anger, she still managed to push herself to do that. That's an extraordinary case. But that is what, when you take that anger, it makes you do things that transforms humanity. But if you allow that anger to seep and turn to bitterness, it's very difficult for you to think logically to be able to do anything that would transform. You end up being just like the villain that you have been trying to fight against. So over time, looking at all of the protests here, one of my favorite moments is that protest in the UK when one of the white supremacist members fell amongst the Black Lives Matter supporters and they picked him up and carried him. Trust me, that man may decide to be racist, but he will never forget that moment of transformation. And that's what that anger, when you use that kind of anger and you allow, because if those people who carried him had allowed the bitterness to seep in like others were doing, they were going to stand there and allow him to be lynched and killed. And then what difference do you think you've made, or how different are you from the people that you're protesting against if you allow that anger to turn to bitterness?
Can I just follow up, Lynne, on, I just want to make a pivot. So you made a point, Leymah, that I think, again, we are struggling mightily in our country. And the example you used was, you said this woman who was nurturing her daughter's killer, had a place to go. So there are, I'm intuiting, and I have read enough of your work to know that you take very seriously the building of civil society to be able to hold this. Talk a little bit about the work of keeping our containers as places where rage gets channeled into peace building, and how civil society plays a role in that.
Let me give an example. I was in Birmingham, and I can give this example and come back to my context. I was in Birmingham, Alabama, and I walked through the museum that is directly opposite the church where the girls were killed. And I walked through that museum and went through the stories of the Black people, our brothers and sisters, through the time of Jim Crow and all of the different things. And then you come to the end of that experience and you see, I think towards the end of it is all of the rights and different things that were granted, but then also there is this last piece of death or pain. So you leave that entire experience filled with rage and hopelessness. Because the way the walk is that you come out of there and is literally just sitting down and thinking about the pain. Even though you can't wash away the pain, but when I talk to those who run that museum, my points to them was, it would be very nice towards the end if you had a place for people to light their candle and breathe. Because that breathing is not necessarily forgiving. That breathing is, how do I now rechannel all of this that I'm feeling into a transformative tool? In the work that we did, it was important for us to, I'll give you another analogy. I use my mom a lot today, but what I realized later on in my life was that my mom was a sponge. And that by the time she had encountered those two main events, the sponge was now dripping. And what she needed was a space to wring it out so that she could function again. Mm. And so in my life and in my work, I realized that even before women encounter violence, we are absorbing a lot because we are the ones that people come to. In this Corona movement, I get calls. Last 2 weeks, I was dealing with girls calling me and talking about their rape experience and all of this. And they, at one point, I felt like the sponge was dripping. So I needed to take a step back and wring it out. So in civil society, there's a lot of dripping sponges all over the place right now. And in order for any kind of sane action or strategic nation building to happen, people need to create the space so that those sponges can be wringed out and that people can come back light, energized, and ready to face the challenge. Because right now, today I was on this Zoom and I told the moderator that if someone asked me what regrets I had when we protested in Liberia, I would say that we didn't have a strategic thinking room for a political future for women. And so right now, in the midst of the protests, there is a need for people to wring out and come back and think strategically on how we can do policy change, how we can write, how we can do this election, how we can do census, how we can do. There's a lot of strategic thinking that needs to take place in the midst of the protest. But the sponges are dripping, and if nothing happens about wringing it out, people will find themselves being sucked in, and they may end up being valiants, just as the people that they're protesting.
Thank you. We're coming to a close. We've got about 6 minutes. Lynne, I want to give you an opportunity and also to make sure that Leymah can talk about her, the foundation that she has founded and the work. Do you have a follow-up question?
Well, I just want to thank you, Leymah, for your metaphors, your clarity, your courage, and you seem fearless, actually. And I know there's no one who's fearless. You have fear, but you have the courage to break through it. And your advice for our sector and in our country is really important to us, and I really appreciate that. And the Gbowee Peace Foundation, is there anything you want to say to the audience and people who might be listening to this recording about how they can support and empower what you're doing?
Well, definitely, but I saw a question that someone put in the chat to say, what does these spaces look like? And it can be any space. You can create your own ritual. You can gather members of your organization, because in these moments, it's very important for us to think about how we take a step back, discharge, and re-energize. And so everyone in our circles, we used to put a pan of water, empty a brand new bottle of perfume in there, have a candle, a brand new towel, soap, and we turn off the light. And we didn't have watches to say we have to be out of here in an hour. So it has to be a commitment to time. So people come and sit around, and once we turn off the light, each person has a candle. And once you light your candle, we know that this is your moment to talk. And you can talk for as long as you want. Some days we started at 7 in the evening and we probably ended at 7 in the next morning, because some people's sponges go back to childhood. Some people's sponges go back to when they saw George Floyd died. Some people's sponges started dripping as a result of some domestic violence they experienced in high school, college. You never know, so you have to give people time to talk. And so you can create those moments so that everyone in your circle are re-energized. And it's amazing Because once you end, you have the opportunity to see people bringing new ideas on how to tackle injustices. I started the Bowie Peace Foundation with two major goals: education and leadership development for young people. Over the last few years, we've managed to send hundreds of children to school. Today, we have two groups of students that we have: the ones that we pay for everything from both school fees to rent. One of the remnants of Ebola that a lot of people don't talk about are the children-headed households. So we have a lot of those young people who lost parents, both parents during Ebola, that we're educating. And then we have our university students. Our youngest student was a baby that came into our program at 8 months old. His mother died of Ebola. Today he's a kindergartner. So we have few boys, but a lot of girls in our program. During this COVID period, we have a COVID relief fund. And if you go to Bowie Peace Foundation USA.org, you see where to give. We've been providing drinking water, cooking water for communities that have no running water. Lynne, you know about Liberia. We've been providing food for families who are really poor and can't afford to. And then we've started an enrichment program for our young students to keep them out of their community, because we've seen increasing sexual and gender-based violence since the lockdown in our different communities. So you can either go to our Facebook page, the Bowie Peace Foundation Africa, or the Bowie Peace Foundation USA.org, and you can give. Nothing is too small, nothing is too big. You'll be pushing the work back. Thank you all so much for having me. Have a great evening. God bless you all.
Emma, thank you very much for the gift of this time for independent sector, but most importantly for many, many civil society leaders who are sponges dripping. And I think you've given us an amazing challenge. So I hope our paths continue to cross. And if we can be of support to you and to the foundation anyway, please, please let us know. And Lynne, as always, my gratitude for your friendship and your wisdom just grows deeper. So thank you both.